The riverboat Rheinprinzessin effortlessly cut through the dark waters of the Rhine, its wake catching the last amber light of evening. John Mercer stood at the bow, his arm draped around his wife's shoulders, watching medieval castles emerge from the mist like something out of a grim fairy tale. 23 years, Raina Mercer said, leaning into his warmth. Can you believe we've been doing this dance for 23 years? John squeezed her closer. At 48, he was still the same lanky history professor who'd stumbled through their first date at a campus coffee shop, though his brown hair now showed threads of silver. Best dance partner I ever had, he murmured, pressing his lips to her temple. Raina laughed, the sound carrying across the water. Her epic precision as a surgeon balanced his academic absent-mindedness perfectly. Where he collected vintage fountain pens and obscure historical texts, she collected moments like these, filing them away in her memory with the same care she used to suture an aorta. Remember our first trip to Europe? She asked. You spent 3 days in the Louvre looking at medieval manuscripts while I sat in cafes reading medical journals. And now look at us, doing stuff together. Because you finally corrupted me with all your historical obsessing. She turned in his arms, her dark eyes sparkling. Besides, someone has to make sure you actually eat when you're lost in the 13th century. The next morning found them wandering the cobblestone streets of Rothenburg ob der Tauber, a town so perfectly preserved it seemed frozen in amber. John's camera hung forgotten around his neck as he pointed out architectural details, his voice taking on the enthusiastic cadence Raina knew meant he was in his element. See those timber frames? Classic Franconian style, probably late medieval. And look. He stopped mid-sentence, his attention caught by something in a shop window. The antique store was squeezed between a bakery and a tavern, its dark windows reflecting the morning light like old eyes. Behind the glass, John had spotted something that made his collector's heart skip. It's beautiful, Raina admitted as they studied the clock. It stood about 18 inches tall, its surface hand carved with intricate patterns that had darkened with age. But it's not exactly our style. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with careful English, confirmed John's suspicions. Yes, genuine, he said, his accent thick but warm. Blackforest craftsmanship, perhaps 250 years old. Very rare design. Instead of the cuckoo bird, we have the woodcutter, yes? A guardian of the forest. John's hands moved over the clock with reverence. The woodcutter figure was remarkable in its detail despite being no larger than his thumb. The tiny man was gaunt, almost skeletal, with a long gray beard. His miniature axe was a work of art itself, its blade keen enough to catch the light. Does it work? Raina asked, ever practical. The shopkeeper's smile flickered. Ah, well, it keeps excellent time. But the woodcutter, he is, how do you say, particular. He comes out only at 12 noon, never at other hours. Perhaps the mechanism needs adjustment, but the clockwork is so delicate. John was already reaching for his wallet. The price was more than reasonable, suspiciously so, given the clock's apparent age and craftsmanship. But something about the piece called to him with an urgency he couldn't explain. John, Raina said quietly, are you sure? We still have 4 more cities to visit, and that thing's going to be a nightmare to pack. But John was already counting out euros, his decision made. I'll figure out the packing. Ray, look at this craftsmanship. You couldn't find work like this anywhere today. The shopkeeper wrapped the clock with unusual care, layering it in tissue paper and foam as if it were made of spun glass. Take good care of it, he said softly. And perhaps do not wind it too tightly, yes? 3 weeks later, back in their Victorian home in Madison, Wisconsin, John had converted the guest bedroom into an impromptu restoration workshop. The clock sat on a towel-covered desk, partially disassembled, its innards exposed like a patient on an operating table. You know, Raina said from the doorway, still in her scrubs from a long day at St. Luke's, most people bring back chocolate and postcards. John looked up, a tiny brass gear balanced on his fingertip. His eyes had the focused intensity she recognized from his graduate school days, when he'd spend 18 hours straight researching his dissertation. "This is incredible, Rai. The mechanism is like nothing I've ever seen. Some of these gears, I swear they predate anything I can find in the reference books." "Just don't electrocute yourself. I'd hate to explain to your department chair that you died restoring a cuckoo clock." "Woodcutter clock," John corrected automatically. "And I'm being careful, and also no electricity in 250-year-old clocks for crying out loud," he added, laughing to himself. That evening, after Raina had gone to bed, John made his first real breakthrough. A tiny adjustment to the escapement wheel, a careful cleaning of gears that seemed almost fused with age, and suddenly the clock came alive. The steady tick-tock filled the quiet room like a heartbeat. At midnight, John held his breath. Nothing. But at 12 noon the next day, as he ate a sandwich at his desk while grading papers, the clock's mechanism whirred to life. But as John watched, transfixed, something extraordinary happened. The woodcutter completed his usual circuit and returned to his house. Then, at exactly 1 o'clock, he emerged again. By evening, John was practically vibrating with excitement. "Ray, you have to see this. The clock's not broken, it was just gummed up or something. Now it's working perfectly." Raina looked up from her medical journal, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "That's great, honey. But can you move it out of the guest room? My sister's visiting next month, and I don't think she'd appreciate the midnight serenade." They moved the clock to the living room mantel, where it sat between Raina's collection of medical conference photos and John's small library of first edition history books. In the flickering light of their gas fireplace, the woodcutter seemed almost alive, his carved features dancing with shadows. "He looks hungry," Raina observed, then immediately felt foolish for the comment. John laughed. "It was normal to be thinner back then, and I have to admit, the detail work is incredible. Look at his little axe. It's still sharp enough to shave with." That night, John slept better than he had in months. The clock's gentle ticking seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat, lulling him into dreams of ancient forests and skilled craftsmen working by candlelight. A week passed. John had returned to his teaching routine at University of Wisconsin, but he found himself distracted during lectures, his mind drifting to the clock waiting at home. Students began to notice their usually energetic professor seemed tired, occasionally losing his train of thought mid-sentence. "You feeling okay?" Raina asked over breakfast, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You look a little pale." John poked at his eggs, his appetite strangely diminished. "Just tired. Maybe I'm fighting something off." "A flu is going around the hospital. Maybe you should take some vitamin C." By the second week, the woodcutter was emerging at 12, 1, and 2 o'clock. The chimes had grown a bit louder, their tone shifting from the original whisper-soft note to something easier to hear and more melodious. John found himself checking his watch obsessively as each hour approached, drawn to witness the little figure's appearances. The first blood appeared on a Tuesday morning. Raina noticed it on John's towel as he stepped out of the shower, just a few dark spots on the white terry cloth. "Did you cut yourself shaving?" she asked, examining his face for nicks. John touched his jaw absently. "I don't think so. Maybe I scratched something in my sleep." But that night, Raina found more blood on the sheets near John's ankle. When she pulled back the covers to investigate, she found a small wound on his left leg. Not quite a cut, not quite a puncture, but something in between. The edges were clean, almost surgical, but they oozed a thin trickle of blood that didn't seem inclined to clot properly. "Honey, you need to look at this." John peered at the wound with detached curiosity. "Huh, that's weird. I don't remember hurting myself." "It looks weird. It might be infected. I'm going to clean it and put some antibiotic ointment on it." But the wound didn't heal. If anything, it seemed to worsen slightly, maintaining its strange, neat edges. John's energy continued to ebb, and his usually robust appetite dwindled to picking at meals. His students began commenting on his increasingly gaunt appearance. By Friday of the second week, the woodcutter was appearing from 12 to 6 o'clock, and the chimes had developed an almost hypnotic quality. John found himself standing before the clock during most performances, watching with glazed fascination as the tiny figure completed its circuits. "John," Raina said that evening, her voice carefully controlled, "I think you should see Dr. Patterson. You've lost weight, you're not sleeping well, and that cut on your leg isn't healing." John waved dismissively, his attention focused on the clock. "I'm fine, just tired from the semester starting up." But he wasn't fine. In the mirror that morning, he'd seen a stranger looking back, hollow-cheeked and pale, with eyes that seemed to have sunk deeper into his skull. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and simple tasks like climbing stairs left him winded. The following Tuesday brought Phil Morrison, John's department chair, to their front door. John answered in his pajamas at 3 in the afternoon, and Phil's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "What the heck, John? What happened to you?" "I'm just a little under the weather," John said, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Phil followed him into the living room, his eyes taking in John's shuffling gait and the way he seemed to lean on furniture for support. "This is more than a little under the weather. You look like you've lost 30 pounds. As Phil spoke, John found his attention drifting to the clock. It was almost 3 o'clock, time for the woodcutter's appearance. He moved toward the mantel, his movements automatic. "The clock's really something, isn't it?" John said, his back to Phil. "See that rust on the woodcutter's axe? I keep trying to clean it off, but it keeps coming back." Phil squinted at the tiny figure as it made its 3 o'clock appearance. What John was calling rust looked suspiciously dark, but he gave it little thought. "John, are you listening to me? I'm saying you need to see a doctor, today." John reached for a tissue from the box on the mantel, wrapping it around his finger as he attempted to clean the miniature axe. The blade was impossibly sharp, sharper than any tool that size had a right to be. It sliced through the tissue and into his thumb as if cutting through butter. "Dang it," John said mildly, watching blood well from the cut. He wrapped more tissue around his thumb, but the blood soaked through immediately. Phil stared in disbelief. "John, how sharp is that thing? And why aren't you more concerned about it?" "I'm fine," John interrupted, though he swayed slightly on his feet. "Just tired. I think I'll go lie down." Phil left feeling deeply disturbed, but not before insisting that Raina take John to the emergency room immediately. At St. Luke's, Dr. Olesen stitched John's thumb while firing questions at Raina. "How long has he been losing weight?" "About 3 weeks, maybe a month." "Any changes in appetite, sleep patterns, energy levels?" "All of the above. He barely eats, he's exhausted all the time, and he's developed this fixation on an antique clock." Dr. Olesen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Fixation?" "He putters with it for hours, and he's been having these wounds that won't heal properly." After John was discharged with antibiotics and instructions to follow up with his primary care physician, Raina found herself alone with the clock while John slept. In the quiet of the evening, she studied the woodcutter figure more carefully. Something was wrong. The figure she remembered from Germany had been thin, yes, but this one seemed different, fuller somehow. The gray beard appeared lighter, more golden, and the axe, which John insisted was rusted, bore stains that looked disturbingly organic. She would talk to John about it tomorrow. Maybe he had replaced it. The next morning brought a catastrophe that would later seem like salvation. John, weakened and dizzy, had been adjusting the clock's weights when he lost his balance. As he put his hands out to steady himself, he dislodged the clock from its place. The ancient timepiece toppled from the mantel, crashing onto the brick hearth below. The sound of splintering wood filled the room like a gunshot. John collapsed beside the wreckage, his strength finally abandoning him completely. The clock lay in pieces, the wooden case cracked, the delicate mechanism exposed, gears scattered across the bricks. The woodcutter figure had broken free from its housing, its tiny axe lying separate from its carved hand. For the first time in years, John wept. But within hours, something remarkable happened. Color began returning to John's cheeks. His appetite stirred. The mysterious wound on his ankle, which had oozed blood for days, finally began to scab over. Raina noticed the change immediately. "How are you feeling?" John looked up from where he sat, sorting the clock's remains. "Better, actually. A lot better. I can't believe I let myself get so run down. Maybe next time you'll listen to what I'm saying?" She couldn't help adding, but with a grin. Finding a clockmaker willing to work on such an unusual piece proved challenging, but Raina eventually located Franz Kellner, a craftsman who specialized in antique timepieces. When she described the broken clock over the phone, his voice took on an odd quality. "Did you say woodcutter? From the Blackforest region?" "That's what the dealer told us." A few odd questions later, and Franz stated, "I'll need to see it. And I may need to bring a colleague. Would tomorrow morning be acceptable?" Franz arrived the next day dressed in practical work clothes, carrying a leather satchel that looked as old as the broken clock. He was younger than Raina had expected, maybe 30, with the careful hands of someone accustomed to delicate work. But it was his reaction to the clock that surprised her. He didn't touch anything. Instead, he photographed each piece from multiple angles as they lay on the bricks of the fireplace. Raina thought he was acting like they were radioactive. "I need to consult with my colleague," he said finally. "May I return this evening with him?" That evening brought Christian Baumann, a man whose expensive suit and scholarly bearing reminded Raina of John's university colleagues. But where John's academic intensity was warm and engaging, Christian's felt cold, analytical. "Dr. Mercer," he said, shaking John's hand. "I understand you've been ill since acquiring this clock. Please, describe your symptoms." As John recounted the past month, Christian and Franz exchanged meaningful glances. When John finished, Christian turned to Raina. "Your fireplace, does it function?" "Yes, but I don't understand." Christian was already gathering pieces of the clock with his gloved hands, his movements suddenly urgent. "Mr. Kellner, if you would assist me." "Wait just a darn minute," John said, struggling to his feet. "That's my clock. What do you think you're doing?" But Franz was already striking a match, touching it to kindling he'd already arranged in the fireplace grate. The flames caught quickly, and before John could react, Christian began feeding pieces of the clock into the fire. "Stop!" barked John as he lunged forward, but his weakened state made him lightheaded, and he stumbled into the couch at the sudden exertion. "Please, Mr. Mercer," Christian said, his voice gentle but firm. "Let me explain." "Your clock," Christian explained, "is what we call an Untergangsuhr, a blood clock. It's a cursed object. They were created during the darkest period of the Black Forest's history, when certain, craftsmen dabbled in arts that should have remained unpursued." Franz stirred the burning remains with a poker. The woodcutter isn't just decoration. It's a vessel, an entity, designed to slowly drain the life force from its victims. Blood feeds it, strengthens it, until it becomes capable of moving from host to host. "That's insane," John said, but his voice lacked conviction. Because deep down, he knew it was indeed insane, but that they were also telling the truth. "The progression is always the same," Christian continued. "First, it activates. The woodcutter emerges at noon, and the chimes are soft and muted. As the woodcutter feeds off the host, it gets stronger and the clock begins chiming at additional hours, 1 o'clock p.m., 2 o'clock p.m., and so on. You may notice the chimes become a bit louder and clearer with each new hour. Meanwhile, the victim experiences fatigue, weight loss, and mysterious wounds that won't heal. As the entity grows stronger from the blood of the host, the wounds multiply and deepen. If it progresses to the point where the woodcutter emerges at 12 o'clock midnight." "What happens at midnight?" Raina asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The host dies," Franz said quietly, "and the clock, or more specifically the entity, begins to focus on the next most important person in the household." The room fell silent except for the crackling of flames. John stared into the fire, watching centuries-old craftsmanship reduced to ash and ember. But instead of grief, he felt relief flooding through him like cool water. Franz used a small brush to collect the remaining metal fragments, screws, springs, and the woodcutter's tiny axe blade. These went into a small metal container that he sealed with wax. "What happens to those?" Raina asked, Burial in consecrated ground, Christian said. Some metals hold traces of the original curse. Better to be safe. As they prepared to leave, Christian paused at the door. Mr. Mercer, you had a very close brush with death. Another week, perhaps 2 at most, and the woodcutter would have come out at midnight. After they left, John and Raina sat in the living room, staring at the empty space on the mantel where the clock had stood. The silence felt peaceful, but questions remained. John was quiet for a long time and then said, I keep thinking about that night in Germany, when I first saw it in the shop window. I felt pulled to it, like it was calling to me. Maybe it was. What if there are others? What if Christian and Franz can't find them all? Late that night, as Raina slept peacefully beside him, John lay awake listening to the sounds of their old house settling around them. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind through the eaves, made him think of tiny footsteps and the chime of a clock that no longer existed. Meanwhile, somewhere else in Madison, in the back room of a curio shop, an antique music box sat waiting for its next owner. Its delicate ballerina figure was poised to dance, her painted smile never wavering, her tiny hands positioned as if reaching for something just out of sight. The shop owner had acquired it from an estate sale just that morning, and already 3 customers had inquired about it. Something about the piece seemed to draw people in, made them linger despite its rather steep price. After all, genuine Blackforest craftsmanship is so rare these days. So very rare indeed,